Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Grid Dialogues, a podcast show where we explore ideas, innovations, and strategies shaping the future of utilities. My name is Sudeep, and I'm your host today. In today's episode, we'll be discussing about AMI technology and the roadmap planning. Advanced metering infrastructure, or AMI, is at the heart of modern utility transformation. But building the right roadmap requires more than technology. It's about strategy, data, and integrations. In this episode, we explore how utilities can plan, evolve, and future proof their AMI systems to drive long term operational and customer value. Joining me to discuss this today is Mr. Steven Lupo. Steve is the managing director of our North America at Trilliant, where he leads strategy, growth, and operations across US and Canadian markets. With over 20 years of experience in the utilities and connected devices, he brings deep industry insight and a strong focus on driving innovation and real value for customers. Hi, Steve. Welcome to Grid Dialogues. To start off, can you share a little bit more about yourself and especially what drove you to working with utilities?
Sure. Thank you, Sudeep. So I've been involved with energy efficiency, energy management, and utility work for the better part of the last 25 years. That started early days with data acquisition and management for purposes of energy management initiatives and qualifying investments across a multitude of different technologies, whether it was HVAC or building envelope performance. We needed a way in those early days to validate the performance of certain investments in that infrastructure. And so we, through almost chance, perfected the art of gathering information and then aggregating it in a web profile that made it actionable. And a lot of that transpired over the years into our world of advanced metering infrastructure and what that means to utility and customers today.
That's great. So, Steve, my first question to you is how do you define a successful AMI roadmap for a utility?
And I think we all know that technology is changing. We know that customer requirements are a dynamic thing, particularly in the world of utilities and municipalities. And I think, to answer the question the best, it's a philosophical change, perhaps, around being comfortable with the ability to plan perhaps a shorter window than what's typically been done in this industry, which is attempting very hard things like planning a 15-year technology roadmap. In 2025, soon to be 2026, that's a very difficult thing to do. So perhaps a more agile approach, shortening the window a little bit and leaving options open for flexibility and different disruption that's going to happen. Not only is it likely to happen, it will happen in the near future. So I think it's more of a horizon and a more pragmatic approach to that planning period. And then, of course, all of the things that come with that, like being pragmatic about what can be achieved in that time frame as well, and doing so in a way that leaves options open and doesn't preclude the adoption of different technologies down the road. If we think about lessons learned from past, I think that's one of the big ones I keep hearing about today.
Right. And, I think you touched base upon it a little bit, but, what would you call as, the real key ingredients if you, want to define that success roadmap?
Yeah, I think it's definitely starts with a list of desirable outcomes. There's no question about that one. But I think it's also challenging the status quo. I think in this market, sometimes there tends to be a bit of following the leader, looking at what others are doing, and maybe we'll play it safe a little bit and we'll stick with that course of action as opposed to looking at something a bit more disruptive. The reality is history has shown when we've taken adoption seriously and looked at different ways of doing things, much cooler things can happen. And you think about the downstream effects of changing the game, changing the needle when it comes to utility costs and how they service customers. I think there's a lot of opportunity there to utilize technology in different ways. And it starts with a different type of thinking and approach.
And so, Steve, I have seen that many utilities are still, in early stages of AMI adoption. So, what do you see are the common gaps especially in their planning approach?
Yeah, I think one of the more common ones that we do see is, just at the high level is perhaps falling into the trap of the first generation of AMI adoption. And so, those hard lessons learned, like getting locked into a particular vendor, I would say, there's a better way in 2025 and for the future. And so, utilities, particularly those that tend to work in cooperation in groups, they represent quite a bit of buying power. And so, I think the second thing is definitely don't underestimate how important your dollar is and how critical that is to AMI vendors. And oftentimes I think utilities will think, oh, I'm too small, or I'm just this little utility out in some state somewhere. No, that spend is critical. These relationships are typically 10 years, if not 20 years. And so the balance of power, so to speak, the ability to negotiate, to drive an outcomes-based decision as opposed to, something that feels a bit more like the vendors in the driver's seat. I would encourage utilities to think about themselves as being in a position of power.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that you correctly mentioned, is balancing that operational goals, like short-term goals, as against, long-term objectives of, moving towards a modernization. There's a lot of, as you mentioned, small utilities are struggling with that, making that decision that how to achieve that balance. So, what would make them really do that? What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's having a long-term plan is great, but be prepared to change it. So write that one in pencil, and that's a difficult thing to do for most utilities in the U.S. and in Canada, because again, this technology has historically been procured in 15-year, 10-year views, and we all know what that means for everything around us that we use every day: Wi-Fi networks, cell phones, automotive, even medical. It's very difficult to even plan 5 to 10 years. And so the more important thing is establishing a near-term window of deliverables and outcomes that are absolutely essential to the operations of the distribution system, whether it be water, electricity, or gas, but also including the customer in that equation. And that also is something that's a bit different today versus even 10 years ago. A recent utility was presenting at a conference that I was at, and they talked about the challenges. This was the CEO of changing the tone and the rhetoric within the organization to behave less like an asset manager and much more like a customer driven entity. And typically, the bigger the utility, the harder that is to do. Because they are natively asset managers and have been in some cases for 100 years, right? And so it's as I started, I think it's a similar kind of answer. It's a cultural shift that's required to think a little differently about AMI outcomes and to shorten the window, to almost force that discipline to look at something like a 5-year output and think about leaving options open in the longer term.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you mentioned it so well. There are so many advances, so many things coming up. But also, with all these, various communication devices, there could be a lot of IoT data that is coming in. There's analytics piece. What would make these utilities, either small or large, really have their AMI technology to be future proof? Because, I think everyone is talking about AMI. Everyone is talking about so many pieces of data coming from so many different sensors and devices and stuff like that. So, what do you think? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think 10 years ago, 15 years ago, all of the rage, all of the excitement was around the ability to connect devices and get data. I don't ever hear that being a challenge, even in our rural customers in 2025. Let's say that the luster around connectivity is kind of solved. There are multiple different ways to do it. A lot of AMI companies use cellular where it makes sense. They use low power WAN technologies. It doesn't really matter as long as the economics line up as our position on connectivity. It's important, but it shouldn't be a driving factor in the decision making from my point of view, beyond a cost consideration. What's much more important is what to do with all this data. And even before we get into anything that looks like artificial intelligence, is machine learning and actionable intelligence is what we like to really focus in on. And so when you think about that 5-year initial roadmap of what the investment in AMI is going to deliver, it is absolutely important to reach into your organizations and highlight what are the desirable outcomes from a data perspective. A day in the life of the user in the network operations team or in the IT settlement team that's responsible for billing. What do they need in terms of outcomes and assistance from the software to help them do their jobs better, to ultimately manage a distribution grid better?
Yeah, I think that's a very critical component. And even while we are working with utilities, one of the things that we have observed is, for the non-technical staff, when they receive, so much of data, and they want to take an action on it, but they have to go back to the tech team and they have to figure out how to do it. So yeah, one of the solutions we recently implemented was, through a conversational AI, if they are able to directly build those kind of dashboards and reports. So I think that's a very critical point that you touched upon. So yeah, and I think one more thing is that with data management, as we are talking about it, is overlooked sometime when we are planning for the AMI. So data strategy is also critical, right, in shaping sustainable AMI roadmap. Would you agree? What do you think on that?
Absolutely essential. Yeah. Again, 15 years ago, 10 years ago, it was very asset centric. This meter is better than that because it has an extra digit on the display, or, hint, nobody even looks at the meter anymore. The data is all transferred digitally, right?
Yeah.
Warranties and things like that, performance and safety records are absolutely essential, but I wouldn't call them part of the key value proposition. That's all upstream now and into the data side. And this industry in the Americas and Canada has certainly been kind of segregated. AMI, when you think about it in Europe and in Asia, the meters are full commoditized items there, and they are very much focused on the value add. And in many of these places, it's a competitive market, so there is a competitive advantage for utility A or marketer A to operate cheaper, better, faster than utility B. We don't deal a lot with that in the North American marketplace, which creates some challenges and maybe a little bit of too much focus on the asset itself. But we can see that changing now. We can see that I think utilities are realizing that they want to be part of the solution and equation to help customers better manage energy. And
Yeah.
they are realizing also that companies like Microsoft and Google and others are already playing a part in this. And not to say that they're fearful, but they want to ensure relevance. They want to ensure that their continued involvement and investment takes care of those customers.
Right, right. With this all AI race and everyone talking about AI in utilities, I think everybody is. But do you see the utilities being really ready for predictive analytics, for AI playing a very critical role in helping them make those decisions?
Yeah, so absolutely is the answer, but we're going to go slow. And slow means we're probably going to go a bit slower than some of the other industries that are less concerned with essential services like delivering clean water or electricity, in the wintertime when heat is required and things like that. And I think, again, that's a pragmatic approach. It is absolutely going to play an essential role when we think about actionable intelligence. AMI2 solutions, next generation AMI solutions deliver a lot of data, right? And it could be a street light is out on this corner, so that's a safety issue. The power is out over here. What AI can do in its most basic form for utilities is allow them to do their jobs easier and better. And that allows them to focus more resources on actions. And some of that is before. So moving away from reactive, the weather came in and pulled the power line down. AI can help with predictive analytics around weather and what that might do to sensitivities in a certain area of the grid. Easy application from the IT perspective that can be developed. And this is where we're going with our own technology as well. So you will see, and it's not just us, all AMI vendors are focusing much more on tools and actionable intelligence as opposed to traditionally it's been, hey, let's talk about meters and the type of network. No, the connectivity just has to work in 2025, and we got to talk about feature-rich applications that utilities need.
Right. What about customer value, Steve? Because many utilities, even though they are implementing, the AMI into their systems, the translation into developing an actual customer value is still lagging behind. So, how do you ensure that when you're planning it?
Yeah, so this is another one that needs a lot of flexibility around it when utilities are thinking about a roadmap to success. And even in that 5 year initial view, it's extremely important to keep options open in terms of CX platforms. I think this is an area that's going to, and I'm already seeing it, so I know it's there. Um, we will be in a world where we'll probably have 50% more CX platforms developed in the next only couple of years. Literally, they're coming out of the woodwork, and some of them are really, really good. And so AMI companies, typically like Trilliant and others, make decisions on should we build or partner for something like this. And this is an area where we'll have an answer of both. We will do some initial investment to help utility customers with better managing their customer inquiries. What's happening with my bill? I don't understand why it's this much higher is one of the biggest ones, right? The second one is understanding power outages, and was it just me or was it more of an area that was affected by something? Was there a threat? Was there a storm situation? Having that data, these are relatively easy to develop and equip in our software. Um, I think this will continue to evolve in a very big way, and leaving the option open for additional partnerships with companies that will build some really, really interesting things. So, if we thought about customer engagement 15 years ago, it was a web portal, and you provided a login that virtually no one ever went to. One of our biggest deployments in Europe also included an in-home display. And we did that also in Canada in early days as well. We worked with some partners. They had some pretty ones that people wouldn't mind having on their living room, and all of those ended up in the drawer. It was just a matter of how long it took to get into the drawer, and nobody touched it again. So, the customer experience philosophy is absolutely essential for utilities to adopt. It's just a matter of how much they're willing to do and over what time. But there are a lot of disruptive companies that are entering this space that they should be thinking about partnering. And sometimes that requires a direct link with their AMI provider. Sometimes it doesn't. It's utilizing data that's in the cloud or in the data lake.
I think you mentioned it so well that 15 years ago, it was just a portal that you deploy, but today, with all the platforms that customers use every day, they expect the same kind of result from the utility CX portals as well, right? I mean, somebody using an Uber or somebody using the all the AI enabled tools, they would expect that my utility platform should look exactly like that and give me that experience. So I think
Correct.
that's very critical.
It is absolutely, and this is, probably the most essential kind of thing is the mindset adoption of customer experience, customer service today, fundamentally different than even 5 years ago, 10 years ago. Companies like Amazon, online retailers, they're really kind of evolving that, and utilities will need a solution to keep with that pace. There's no question about it. Gone are the days where it will be okay to receive a utility bill that I did not anticipate would be double or triple as high. That is like the absolute worst case. It would be like filling your car with petrol or gasoline and then getting the bill a month later that it was 3 times the amount. This reactive kind of approach to these types of essential services is going to be a thing of the past.
Right, right. So, Steve, what else do you think? What are some of the regulatory changes, or you spoke about cultural shifts, philosophical change that is needed within utilities. But what about regulators? What about other organizational changes which are necessary for these for the utilities to execute AMI roadmaps more effectively?
Yeah, I think in early days of the initial deployment of AMI solutions, what we saw in practice was a particular division within a utility would kind of take the reins, and that would shift depending on the size of the utility, but also their major constraints of the time. So if this particular utility had a issue with getting accurate bills because their meter readers were not able to get to, they had some difficulties with physical access and things like that, then it was an IT and billing led AMI endeavor. If it was a inability to supply meters because of some political unrest or who knows what, then it was supply chain who was leading the charge, and everyone else just kind of played a bit of a supportive role. Um, I would say that needs to change today. There needs to be a multi-pronged representation from asset folks, from performance, which would cover billing and things like that, and definitely the data management side. And this kind of trifecta of folks needs to work together to really drive the most value and to be able to speak to the value that will come from the investment of these solutions. And that is not only a regulatory thing, it's that too, but it's a customer confidence piece as well. When municipalities, when utilities, whether they're investor owned or not, make large investments that are going to impact bill payers monthly and probably for a long time, they want to hear confidently that this is good, not just for them, but for the broader service territory. And I think that articulation, if it's only single threaded or mostly single threaded, we're doing this because we want to know when the street lights are out. That's one application. But broadening the message around the benefits of technology adoption streamlines the regulatory process. You get folks on board beforehand and before you're there ripping out equipment, and it's just a much better prognosis for success of the project.
Right, right. And lastly, Steve, what trends do you think will really define in the next 10 years or couple of decades, of AMI evolution, and what utilities need to do today, to be prepared for that kind of trend?
I think the biggest shift again is a cultural one away from device-centric things. As simple as the need to just work with one vendor, that shouldn't be a thing in 2025. Interoperability of devices is not a technical challenge. It might be a market or competitive challenge, but these things are already solved in other places in the world. And it's again, when it's not a technology challenge, if utilities are equipped, if they're working together in consortiums, especially, they can drive a lot of change very quickly. And interoperability is one of the biggest things. You don't want to end up in a position where you're single threaded, and not only do you have a solution that is only by one supplier, but you're unable to upgrade that solution over time. That's another one that I think is so important, is the flexibility and upgradability to avoid obsolescence with devices. I think, on the data side and back end, as long as the chief stakeholders are involved in the process early, I think it's a good thing. There's a lot that can be done, particularly with AI. There was an interesting philosophy even 5 years ago where perhaps it was over reliance on, we need the meter to do all of this. And it was essentially driving the cost of that device way up because there was perhaps an over focus on computational and memory requirements to really get down to some extremely granular metrics around even just a residential home. And the reality is, with most HVAC devices, which is the chief consumer of energy in a home, right? It's going to be your air conditioning or your heating. This stuff is already digitally connected. You probably don't need to go to and spend that much extra to equip an edge device to that level. You know what I mean? Technology is evolving regardless. You don't necessarily need a dragster to take your family to the grocery store. You don't need an NHRA race car. And so finding that balance of technology that is needed in the next 5 years and the next 10 years is going to be really important. And I think, the industry sometimes has a tendency to maybe oversell, a requirement as opposed to, what are the options to really solve this challenge using all available technology in the marketplace.
Steve, that was amazing, and thank you so much for helping all our audience touch upon so many critical points for the AMI roadmap. I think some of the points that you mentioned about the cultural shifts, about having that philosophical mindset, the need for the AMI rollouts in the next 10-20 years, and how it affects different areas. I think that was amazing. So thank you so much for that. And anything else that you would like to share today with our audience around the topic, or anything else that you feel like?
I think, let's keep the conversations going. What I'm really encouraged about, and not just in the Americas, but we're seeing more and more of this in Europe and definitely in places like Southeast Asia and India, is collaboration and discussion. And that leads to education, right? And so when you think about what is possible in as a utility, in terms of adopting, whether it's an upgrade of current technologies or perhaps considering a new, it doesn't have to be single threaded. It doesn't have to be something that you live with for 15 years. And there are a lot of options on the table, especially in the data customer centric, feature rich side of the equation on where this is all going. I think we're going to see more and more new industry players coming along. So it's important to maintain that flexibility.
Yes, absolutely. So thank you so much, Steve, for joining us today. It
Welcome.
was a great pleasure to have you on the show. And
Thank you very much.
yes, appreciate it, Steve. I hope you all enjoyed today's episode. So if there's anything else, any other topics that you'd like us to cover, please help us by sharing it in the comment section. So that's it from today's episode of the Grid Dialogues. See you next time. This podcast is brought to you by Grid, a platform helping electric, water, and gas utilities maximize the value of their smart metering and operational data. Feel free to follow us on our website and LinkedIn. You can find the links in the description below. And if you like this podcast, please do the usual: like, share, and subscribe to our channel.